Hi everyone, I'm Adam Dede and welcome to my Neuro Journal Club. Thanks for joining. So in the last couple of videos we've been talking about the brain's alpha rhythm and the ways in which the alpha rhythm can be trained, whether by biofeedback or through meditation. But I haven't really said anything about what exactly does the alpha rhythm mean in just normal everyday circumstances. So today we're going to talk about a paper called Measurements by Biphasic Changes of the Alpha Band Amplitude as Indicators of Arousal Level by Toyoshima, and Yamauchi from 1996. And there's a lot to kind of unpack in that title. So we're going to be looking at the alpha band, obviously, and how that may be associated with arousal. And here when we talk about arousal in a psychological sense, we're talking about kind of how amped up, focused, or drowsy, lethargic, unfocused somebody is, somewhere along that kind of spectrum. So the idea that the alpha rhythm may be related to arousal has been around for a long time. So this is a figure from Lindsley, 1952, in which he kind of puts together these different brain oscillations or EEG patterns that you might see in people of various different states of arousal. So at the top we can see when someone's excited, really amped, focused on things, you're going to have a lot of this kind of fast, small amplitude activity. And then as someone becomes relaxed, you're going to have alpha band activity, classic large amplitude 8 to 12 cycle per second waves. And then when they get more drowsy and eventually asleep and then into deep sleep, we see that alpha rhythm go away again. So this led generally the idea of an inverted U-shaped curve associated with alpha band amplitude and arousal. So this makes it so that the amplitude of alpha is not going to tell you specifically about somebody's arousal level. Instead, you're going to have to think about where they are on this inverted U-shaped curve. And here are a couple examples of possible situations. So in the top left in panel A, you can see here that somebody could be in a situation where when they're at rest, they have relatively high alpha, and then when they receive some kind of stimulation, alpha drops down. And this is kind of classically how alpha has been interpreted, this idea that more alpha is associated with less focus or less attention. But on the flip side, if we look in panel B, you could see exactly the opposite pattern of results associated with alpha if somebody were on the other side of this U-shaped curve, if in the sense that as someone rests, they're actually going to have a reduction in the amount of alpha, and then with some sort of small amount of stimulation, they're going to actually increase the amplitude of alpha. Then on the bottom left, we can see yet another situation where if somebody is resting, or someone is kind of near their peak alpha, where a reduction in arousal or an increase in arousal may be somewhat difficult to see just because they're kind of at that plateau at the very top of the inverted U-shaped curve. So Otto et al. Wanted to try and see if they could find evidence for this inverted U association with arousal. So they designed their study like this. Participants sat in a comfortable and quiet, dimly lit room for 1 hour. So this is definitely a situation where they're going to get more and more drowsy as the hour goes on. And every 10 minutes, there was a 160-second experimental session. So down here in the bottom left, you can see kind of a schematic of what this would look like. You're just kind of sitting in this quiet, dimly lit room, very comfortable, warm room, and getting more and more drowsy. And every 10 minutes, there will be 160 seconds of EEG measurement and an experimental task. And what did that look like? So each experimental session had two 80-second blocks. So in the first block, they rested with their eyes closed. So this is going to be really almost sleep-inducing, you know. And in block 2, they're going to have to press a button whenever a tone is played, but their eyes are still closed. Now it's important that this block 2 task, the tone reaction time task, it's really a small amount of stimulation. If you ask someone to open their eyes and focus on, you know, an exciting video game, they're going to immediately drop entirely out of alpha and go into that excited state that we saw in the first figure earlier. So they wanted something that was just going to kind of move people back and forth a small amount on the possible inverted U-shaped curve so that they could really get a sense of what that curve looked like. So they used the reaction time task of pressing a button as soon as the participant heard a tone as a measure of arousal, the idea being that the more aroused somebody is, the faster their reaction time is going to be, the more focused they're going to be. And so the idea then is if the inverted U is there, then there should be a sweet spot where participants have a baseline that's really near the peak. So what's that going to look like? So when the baseline is near the peak, then you're going to have this really interesting phenomenon where rest period alpha decrease is going to mean less aroused and thus slower reaction time. But a task period alpha decrease is going to mean more aroused and faster reaction time. So the exact same phenomenon with the alpha amplitude, a decrease in both cases, is going to lead to opposite effects in the reaction time depending on if we're looking at that decrease during the rest period moving towards less aroused or during the task period moving towards more aroused. So let's see what they found. Oh, and one other little point here. It's key that they calculated all of this both on individual level data and also by using a change rate rather than using raw amplitude. So the reason for this is twofold. Individual variability in alpha, everybody has a slightly different frequency of alpha, everybody has a slightly different propensity to exhibit alpha in their EEG. But also, raw amplitude is really hard to interpret since this whole thing of the inverted U gives you this implication that people are moving on this curve rather than on a linear path. So interpreting raw values gets difficult. So to calculate a change rate in alpha, they did it as follows. The change rate upon stimulation was the amplitude of alpha in task period X. So they had those 7 different task periods. So task period X, subtract the amplitude of alpha in the rest period X. So like if we're looking at session 3, for example, they would take task session 3, subtract rest session 3, and that would be their index for the change in alpha as associated with the task in session 3. And then they would divide that by the amplitude of the task in session 3 plus the amplitude of the rest alpha in session 3. And in this way, they're kind of normalizing for the overall amplitude and trying to get some sort of a standardized index that can be compared across participants. And then to look at the change rate after rest, now here, rather than comparing task to its local rest, they're comparing rest to rest, and they're going to compare rest in whatever the relevant session is that they're trying to calculate for, and subtract out the amplitude of alpha in the first rest period. So say that they're looking at session 3, for example, they would take the amplitude of alpha in session 3, subtract out the amplitude of alpha in session 1, and that would give them some idea of the change in alpha. We got Aziza here. That would give them some idea of the change in alpha associated with session 3 rest. And that gives you an idea of kind of overall how drowsy is this participant getting relative to that first session. So results. So they found this sweet spot in session 3. And what we're looking at here is the correlation of those change rate measures that they had with reaction time. So here, a positive correlation means that as alpha gets bigger, the reaction time also gets bigger, and so that would mean then that someone is less focused. They are slower to react. Bigger reaction times, less focused. It's kind of a weird little mismatch to think about. But you can see here that in the third session, the session that occurred at 20 minutes into the overall experiment, there's this strong positive correlation in both frontal and occipital electrodes showing that the more alpha there is, the slower the participants are to react. And then in that same session, we can see that during the rest period, it's the less alpha, the slower they are to react. So we have that, that pattern that we were looking for where there's opposite effects of alpha on reaction time depending if we're looking at the rest versus if we're looking at the stimulation or the task period. And then, as you can see in all of the other sessions, the correlations were generally pretty weak. And what this suggests is that they were just far away from that sweet spot at the top of the curve. So looking at it in a little bit more detail, we can see in session 3, we're going to look at that change rate measure. So this is how much different is the alpha amplitude during the task. And they're just focusing in on session 3 here. And over here we're looking at the frontal electrodes, versus occipital electrodes, and you can see that the faster reaction time, so the more focused participants, are showing a bigger decrease in their alpha amplitude during the task. So that would be an indication that they're moving from the peak of the curve down towards the more aroused side. And you can see that in both the occipital and the frontal electrodes, that there's this really nice strong correlation. But then if we take a look at the same data but now during the rest period, we can see that it's actually the higher amplitude alpha is associated with the fastest reaction times, and that's true again for both the frontal and the occipital electrodes. So this time that higher alpha is an indication that they're closer to the peak, whereas over here where they're down at the lower level of alpha, that's where they've actually fallen down to the non-aroused side towards sleep of that inverted U-shaped curve. So then they looked at the data another way. How did the task and rest alpha relate directly to each other? So now instead of looking at it in terms of relative to reaction time, they're just looking directly at that task alpha versus rest alpha. And sorry, we have another cat interruption. Hey, Aziza. Okay, so what you can see here is that the correlation looks even stronger with a situation where the change rate during rest, or after rest, the bigger the increase after rest, the bigger the decrease that you're going to see when stimulation occurs. And what that's telling us really is that the closer to the peak they are, the more space there is for them to then fall down towards the aroused side of the peak after rest. Whereas if they are down here and have this negative, then you're actually going to see them have an increase with stimulation, indicating that they're climbing up the curve from the non-aroused side to the aroused side of the curve. Now, you may be asking, okay, well, they have this like complicated change rate measure. Was that even really necessary? What about the raw amplitude of alpha? And it turns out that that was a pretty necessary thing, because you can see here that when they look just at the raw alpha band amplitude, sorry, she's being very rambunctious. When you look just at the raw alpha band amplitude, you can see that there's no relationship to the reaction time. So it really is important to look at this relative measure rather than just looking at the raw amplitude to be able to say something about the arousal of the participants. So summarizing arousal and alpha. Raw alpha amplitude doesn't really say too much about arousal. And this may be because of individual variability, but it seems really strongly that it's because of this inverted U-shape situation. So what does high alpha mean then? So the high alpha state is neither a state of hyperfocused alertness and focus, nor a state of really drowsy sleep. The alpha state lies kind of somewhere in the middle, where if you are down at that drowsy sleep side, you're actually going to be getting more focused as your alpha amplitude increases. But that's not as focused as you could be. You could be yet more focused, where alpha would then drop out again. And it's this weird middle ground between being super hyper-focused, like you're trying to fly a fighter plane, and being super drowsy, like you're falling asleep watching TV. And that middle ground, that's where you're going to get the strongest alpha. So what about the scalp topography? Now, this is kind of an important question, just because in the last Neurojournal Club video, we talked about how meditators actually exhibit higher frontal alpha than occipital alpha. And we can see here that in this group of normal subjects, that was entirely not the case. This is really the classic finding that occipital alpha is consistently stronger than frontal alpha. And what we're looking at here is just the alpha band amplitude, so just the raw amplitude, and measured across the 7 experimental sessions. And we can see it's pretty stable, and it is consistently stronger in the occipital than in the frontal. So cool, that's the video for today. Hope you learned something about alpha band activity and how it relates to arousal level of participants. And if you liked the video, please go ahead and subscribe, and thanks for watching.